culture as such.
Our focus has been on the sometimes raucous U.S. national elections, but there's been another election. And a longtime friend, Taiwan. The winner is incumbent President Ma. What does this mean for Taiwan, for China, and for the U.S. relationship? We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. As we enter 2012, the United States is paying increasing attention to the Asia-Pacific region. For example, it will begin deploying Marines to bases in northern Australia as part of an effort to shore up U.S. interests in the area. Of course, China is keeping a close eye on these developments. Furthermore, the China-Taiwan relationship, though improving in recent years, is always of key concern to the United States. The result of Taiwan's contentious presidential election will certainly be a factor in the China-Taiwan-United States dynamic going forward. We will discuss China-Taiwan relations, the impact of the election, and the U.S. connection with today's guest. Scott Kastner is a leading China-Taiwan scholar, an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. He is the author of Political Conflict and Economic Interdependence Across the Taiwan Strait and Beyond. Hello, Dr. Kastner. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. We're talking today about the China-Taiwan relationship. This is a tense one that goes back many, many decades. Tell us a little bit about it from your perspective.
Yeah, it's a relationship that historically has been at times quite tense, but that has improved dramatically over the past several years since the current Taiwan president, Ma Ying-jeou, came into office in 2008. Mm-hmm. Really, as recently as 2005, the PRC passed an anti-secession law, which invoked the concept of non-peaceful means as a response to possible Taiwan moves toward independence. As recent as 2008, you had countries like the United States being very critical of Taiwan for pursuing a referendum with regard to entry into the UN that the U.S. saw as kind of a backdoor way to get public support for a change in Taiwan's name.
Well, for those who may not have watched this as closely as you have, take us back a little bit in history so that we can understand how all of this started.
The Taiwan issue is a long-standing issue. It really goes back at least to the end of the Chinese Civil War, when the nationalists who lost the Civil War basically retreated to Taiwan with their government, the Republic of China. Whereas the victorious Communist Party kind of set up the People's Republic of China on the mainland. For decades afterwards, the nationalists continued to view themselves as the legitimate government of all of China. Whereas the PRC, the People's Republic of China, continued to view Taiwan as a part of China and viewed it as an important long-term objective to bring Taiwan into the fold with the rest of the People's Republic.
Now, originally the world did view Taiwan as the successor.
Right.
And then it switched, and the PRC became the recognized successor.
Right. Taiwan, the ROC, continued to hold the China seat in the United Nations, for example, until 1971, when it switched to the PRC. And the United States continued to maintain diplomatic relations with the ROC until the late 1970s, before switching to the PRC. But more recently, there's been kind of a shift in the dynamic with democratization in Taiwan. More and more Taiwanese really began to kind of openly question the extent to which Taiwan should really be thought of as a part of China, right? And in the 1990s and the 2000s, you had political leaders in Taiwan who kind of sought to emphasize Taiwan's sovereignty to a greater degree. Of course, this alarmed elites in Beijing, and you had considerable tensions, especially beginning in 1995 or so.
Help us understand the concern in Beijing. How do those in the PRC view Taiwan?
There's a belief that Taiwan is fundamentally a part of China, right? And it's seen as something that a historical wrong, that it's not a part of China now. The United States intervened at the end of the Chinese Civil War, right, by kind of the Truman administration announced that it was going to patrol the Taiwan Strait after the outbreak of fighting in Korea. So it's viewed as kind of unfinished business, essentially, from the Chinese Civil War. And it's seen as kind of an important long-term objective in China that Taiwan must be formally reunified with the rest of China.
And how does China see the United States in terms of this relationship? We once had a bilateral security pact with Taiwan. Now that it has changed, do the Chinese still see the Taiwan Relations Act as interference in its
absolutely.
relationship with Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly kind of viewed, the PRC views U.S. policy toward Taiwan as interference, essentially, in China's internal matters. The United States, I mean, even though it switched diplomatic recognition in the late 1970s, the United States has continued to maintain a fairly robust relationship with Taiwan. Certainly, I think you could kind of view them as the United States and Taiwan, if not as official allies, right? The Defense Pact was abrogated when the U.S. switched diplomatic recognition. But certainly you could view them as something like tacit allies. The United States, of course, continues to sell weapons to Taiwan and so forth.
Now, this was a time before China was rising in terms of where it is now. And the United States also was engaged in active security relationships with other nations in the region. And we reference the new agreement with Australia to move troops into that country. China has heralded its rise as a peaceful one, and it has been critical of these types of military moves, suggesting that they threaten the stability and security of the region. What do you make of that analysis?
I think China has tended to view kind of the U.S. alliance system in the region as kind of essentially being geared toward China, right, as an effort to kind of contain China's rise. After the Cold War, it's not, as obvious why the United States needs to maintain robust alliances in the region, if not for kind of thinking about the rise of China in the long term. So I think that China kind of has tended to view the U.S. alliance system in the region as somewhat threatening.
And it feels an obligation to make noise publicly about this.
Right.
But do you think that really amounts to anything? Do you think that it perceives a serious threat, and is it moving to counter that threat?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think that it's hard to, the U.S. of course has had a long-term alliance with Australia, so it's hard to imagine that moving some Marines to Australia greatly changes the dynamic of that alliance relationship. At least from my standpoint, it's hard for me to see how that specific, unless it's meant as a signal directed at China. But
Now, you talked about the China-Taiwan relation in the years preceding 2008. Did you at any time sense that they were so contentious that there could have been conflict?
I've never viewed actual military conflict, right, like war, right, as a highly likely scenario in the cross-strait relationship. It's certainly something that in the back of your mind is something that's plausible. It's a possibility. Certainly in 1995, 1996, there was a prolonged crisis in the Taiwan Strait where both sides engaged in significant military exercises, culminating with PRC missile tests near Taiwan's major ports, right in the run-up to Taiwan's 1996 presidential election. The U.S. responded to this by deploying aircraft carrier battle groups to the vicinity. So certainly there are pretty significant tensions from time to time. And again, when Taiwan's previous president, Chen Shui-bian, was reelected in 2004, relations were also quite tense then. And I think that there was a great deal of pessimism in the PRC about kind of where long-term trends were going in Taiwan. I think some analysts worry that over the long term, military conflict might be unavoidable. So it's certainly something that, if not something that would be likely, it's certainly something that is very much a possibility.
But then since 2008, we've had a different environment. Talk a little bit about that, some of the changes that have occurred that have contributed to an improvement in the relationship.
When Taiwan's current president, Ma Ying-jeou, came into office in 2008, he had campaigned on explicitly on trying to improve the relationship with the PRC. He kind of viewed extensive economic links between the two sides, for example, as something that was unavoidable and something that potentially could contribute to stability in the Taiwan Strait and could contribute to economic development in Taiwan. So he pursued he emphasized that as president he would pursue pragmatic policies. As a candidate, he emphasized that his policy would be one of no independence, no unification, and no use of force while president. He kind of referred to it as the 3 no's policy. And he's pursued very much a pragmatic approach toward the PRC. So for example, one of the roadblocks to political negotiations between the two sides since the 1990s has kind of centered on this issue of the one China principle and whether Taiwan should be kind of thought of as a part of China. Ma, when he came into office, indicated that he was willing to embrace a concept referred to as the 92 consensus, referring back to an agreement reached in Hong Kong back in 1992, where supposedly the two sides basically agreed that one China exists, but the two sides have different interpretations as to what it means. Ma was kind of willing to embrace this consensus, and this was enough to satisfy Beijing and allow kind of a resumption of political dialogue, which had been basically stalled out since the 1990s. And since then, you've seen a number of agreements, mostly on economic and kind of functional areas, increased agreements to increase tourism across the two sides, open up direct trade and travel linkages between the two sides, and ultimately, a couple years ago, the two sides reached a broader economic cooperation framework agreement, which entails kind of broader trade liberalization between the two sides.
Now, wasn't a lot of this necessary as dictated by events? Because as Ma came to office, Taiwan and the rest of the world were plunging into the worst of the recession that we've been suffering.
Yeah, I think that Ma argued, and I mean, just to kind of step back for a second. So even during the period of time when tensions were quite high under Ma's predecessors, under Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian, economic integration proceeded quite rapidly across the Taiwan Strait. By the late 1990s, mainland China had become the principal destination for Taiwan's outbound foreign direct investment. And by the early 2000s, the PRC became Taiwan's primary trading partner, right? So I think kind of, the reality is that the two sides had already become deeply intertwined economically by the time Ma came into office. And Ma kind of argued that Taiwan's economic future increasingly kind of depended on a stable relationship with the PRC.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are critics who have suggested that he moved too rapidly, becoming economically entangled with China to the point that it might be dangerous and it might set Taiwan on a course that would inevitably lead to reunification on terms that might not be favorable to Taiwan. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a concern, and it's been a long-standing concern going back way back, for a couple decades, as the two economies have become more intertwined, as more and more of Taiwanese, Taiwan's major corporations wanted to invest in China, kind of even going back to the early 1990s. Many in Taiwan worried about the political implications of this. Was it making Taiwan too dependent on the PRC economically? Was it giving the PRC leverage over Taiwan? Was Taiwan essentially putting too many eggs in the China basket? Did it make Taiwan vulnerable to economic instability in the PRC? But the reality has been that it's been very difficult, even for Li Denghui and Chen Shui-bian, Ma's predecessors, to really reverse this process. Li certainly tried and implemented some policies that sought to kind of slow down economic exchanges, but I think at best those policies had limited success.
Mm-hmm. How has all of this resonated in Washington, where we keep a very watchful eye over the cross-strait relationship?
I think that Washington has generally welcomed, I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but I think broadly speaking, it's welcomed the improved relationship that we've seen since Ma entered into office. And the reason is that, I mean, there was concern under the Chen administration that that there might be instability in the region that would require the U.S. to become involved in militarily. So I think that Washington has viewed stability in the Taiwan Strait as a good thing, and in the past, the United States has also welcomed kind of an improved economic relationship between the two sides as well, and has tended to view that as being a stabilizing factor in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. If you could list what you think are maybe the three biggest advances in the China-Taiwan relationship since 2008, what would those be?
So number one would probably just be the generally improved political climate between the two sides. The fact that the two sides have been talking again frequently, in these kind of quasi-official negotiations. I think second would be kind of a normalization of the trading relationship, the economic relationship between the two sides, and culminating in the ECFA agreement, but also including things like opening up direct linkages across the Taiwan Strait. So, a few years ago, you couldn't take a passenger flight from Taipei to Beijing, and now it's very simple to do that, right? Anyone could, book a flight directly across the Taiwan Strait. So I think
going the other way, it's
absolutely
the same ease.
Yeah. So, I don't know what would be number three. And that, I guess maybe increased people-to-people exchanges.
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And I remember in 2008 when we were looking at Ma's proposed infrastructure plan, a lot of it was related to the potential tourism that could come from China, and there were some who were skeptical, but as we've seen, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of tourists coming from the mainland to Taiwan.
That's right. That's right.
How do you think this plays in the rest of the region? Because the China-Taiwan relationship is important not just to the two governments, but it really affects the stability and security of much of East Asia.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that, part of the answer depends on where you think this ultimately is heading, assuming that it kind of continues, the current detente in relationship proceeds. I think that most in the region view stability in the Taiwan Strait as very much desirable. So, for example, in 2008, Taiwan held a referendum on entry into the United Nations, asking the Taiwan people whether Taiwan should enter the United Nations under the name Taiwan. And again, many, including obviously the PRC, but also the United States, were critical of the referendum, viewing it as kind of a backdoor way to get popular support for a change in Taiwan's internationally used name, right? So because the referendum referred to Taiwan's entry into the UN, not the ROC's entry into the UN. A number of countries in the region were also critical of this, right? So you had other countries in the region kind of criticizing Taiwan for pursuing this sort of policy because they viewed it as potentially destabilizing, and they worried about the potential for conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And a lot of those worries have kind of dissipated under the Ma administration. So I think that in general, there's kind of a welcoming of the reduction in tensions. If you kind of ask, well, if the process were to kind of proceed to something on the political level, potentially moving toward political unification, say, I think that there would be a lot more unease in the region.
Mm-hmm. Now we have election results in, and it appears that President Ma has won re-election. So do we then talk about a continuation of what you've been describing, or do you see, because of some of the criticism that emerged during the campaign, maybe a slowing down of the process?
Yeah, well, I think that Ma is very much committed to a stable relationship across the Taiwan Strait and believes that increased economic integration or continued economic integration is something that facilitates economic development in Taiwan and so forth. I don't think that Ma is eager to move forward on thornier political issues. And in fact, during the election campaign in the fall, Ma kind of hinted at the possibility that at some point, in the next decade, that perhaps Taiwan could consider moving toward a peace agreement with the PRC if conditions were ripe and there were support for it in Taiwan and so forth. And he came under a great deal of attack domestically, and he kind of backed away from this idea during the campaign. And I think that the fact of the matter is that in Taiwan, there's very little appetite for kind of anything hinting at kind of moving in the direction of unification. There's a pretty strong consensus in Taiwan that Taiwan is a sovereign state, and that there's really very little support for moving in the direction of unification, even over the longer term in Taiwan.
And that would be the case no matter what happens in Beijing?
Yeah, and in fact, there was a recent poll. So there's a political scientist at Duke, Emerson Yeo, that conducts some polls in Taiwan that kind of probe into kind of the conditionality of people's preferences on cross-strait issues. One of the questions that he asks is, suppose that the political, social, and economic conditions between mainland China and Taiwan become similar, or the differences become small. Do you favor unification in this sort of a scenario? So this kind of implies that you have democratization in China, that China's level of economic development is caught up with Taiwan, and so forth.
You might have a big Taiwan scenario in China.
Yeah. So in this kind of a scenario, even the kind of these most favorable of circumstances, right? You still had in the most recent version of this poll, I think something on the order of 56% of respondents said they did not favor unification, and only something around 30% favored unification in that scenario. And if you just kind of ask people straight up, if you just look at the surveys, do you support, where do you stand on the independence versus unification type issues? Support for unification is very small. I mean, it's in the neighborhood of 10%, even kind of thinking longer term.
The support for independence is also small.
The support for independence is also quite small, yeah.
It seems that Taiwan would remain in the status quo, and that's probably going to elicit the best response from Beijing. So with President Ma serving another term, do you foresee stability across the strait, continuation of what we've experienced so far?
I think that it's likely that things will stay relatively stable. I think that there are still some downside risks. There's a possibility that Beijing will start to become more impatient on some of these political issues and start asking for more in return for kind of continued development of the economic relationship.
What would spark that? Would it be pressure from the more conservative forces, or would there be other reasons?
It could be. You could imagine the PLA, for example, pushing for a kind of a stronger policy toward Taiwan, one that reaped more obvious kind of political benefits for the PRC, kind of made it more obvious that Taiwan was actually moving in the direction of unification. There's a lot of uncertainties about what's going to happen in the PRC moving forward as well. There's a leadership transition later this year. There's some concern that the economy in the PRC may be slowing down. Obviously, there've been some incidents of social instability in China. So it's hard to say what's going to happen in the years ahead. But you could certainly imagine scenarios where there's kind of more pressure on, say, a new leader in the PRC to adopt tougher policies toward Taiwan, or to at least with Ma still as Taiwan's president. Obviously, he's not pushing for Taiwan independence. At least kind of putting some more subtle pressure on Taiwan to kind of make some progress on political issues.
Is there anything that you could foresee happening in the region that might put pressure on the China-Taiwan relationship? I'm thinking maybe something could develop on the Korean Peninsula with the new leadership there.
I think it's really hard to say. Certainly, there's various bad scenarios that one can imagine for, with regard to instability on the Korean Peninsula, and it's hard to say what would happen if there's, say, a collapse in the North Korean regime.
From an economic perspective, as the world seems to be slowly emerging from the recession, the economic dynamism of the combination of China and Taiwan presumably is positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Most stakeholders in the region, and certainly the United States, kind of view stability in the cross-strait relationship as something that's very desirable. And part of the reason why it's viewed as desirable is because there is so much economic dynamism there. and the ripple effects of a great deal of instability in the Taiwan Strait would potentially be quite considerable.
Good. Well, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Kastner.
Sure, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.